My son-in-law looked me in the eye and said I was nothing more than a helpless old woman. And in that moment, Margaret Collins did not respond, did not argue, and did not even blink. She simply placed her teacup back onto the saucer as if the words carried no weight at all. But inside her mind, something shifted in a way no one in the house could yet understand. Margaret was 68 years old, living in a quiet suburban home in Ohio that once felt full of laughter. Now the silence between rooms felt heavier than any conversation she had ever endured. Her daughter Emily avoided eye contact that evening while Jason Miller, her son-in-law, spoke freely as if he owned the air itself. He had a habit of speaking for everyone, especially when he assumed Margaret no longer mattered in family decisions. Started with small things, like not asking her opinion about dinner plans or home expenses. Then it became words spoken under breath. Phrases like "she won't understand" or "it's easier this way." Margaret never corrected them. She observed. She listened more than she spoke. And in that silence she began to see patterns others ignored. Jason often checked documents on the kitchen table, turning pages quickly whenever she entered the room. He would pause for only a second, then continue as if her presence was part of the furniture. Emily tried to smile more often around him, as though maintaining peace required her silence. Margaret noticed everything, even when she acted as though she noticed nothing at all. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, she began to understand that being overlooked was not the same as being powerless. Jason believed he was in control of the household, but control often hides where arrogance refuses to look. Margaret did not challenge him. She waited, and in waiting, she quietly began to collect every detail he carelessly revealed. The house in Ohio remained still, but beneath that stillness, something was already changing direction. Margaret would later recall this period not as chaos, but as preparation. No one noticed the way she began keeping old papers, or how she started asking questions that seemed casual but were carefully chosen. Jason answered them without suspicion, convinced she would never understand their meaning. That was his first mistake. Margaret sat alone that night after everyone had gone to bed, staring at the quiet living room. The television reflected her face, older than she remembered, but steady in a way she had not felt in years. She realized then that being underestimated had given her something unexpected. Time, and time, in Margaret Collins' world, was never wasted. Outside, the Ohio wind moved gently through the trees, pressing against the windows like a reminder that change does not announce itself loudly. Inside, Margaret turned off the light and sat in silence, no longer the woman they thought she was. She understood everything now and decided to say nothing yet at all. The next morning in the quiet suburban house in Ohio, Margaret Collins moved through her routine with the same calm precision she had always used for decades. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh coffee as she stood by the window watching the early sunlight stretch across the backyard. Nothing appeared different on the surface, yet everything inside her awareness had changed. Down the hall, she could hear the faint sound of her daughter Emily preparing for work, drawers opening and closing with hurried efficiency. Jason Miller had already left earlier than usual, claiming he had an important meeting in the city, though he rarely shared details unless it benefited his image of control. Margaret noted the timing without reaction. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the same table where so many family conversations had taken place, though recently she had been less included in them. When Emily entered the kitchen, she smiled briefly, but her eyes carried the tiredness of someone constantly balancing invisible expectations. She asked if Margaret had slept well, a polite question that no longer carried real curiosity. Margaret simply nodded and watched as Emily checked her phone repeatedly, as if waiting for instructions from someone who was not present. After Emily left, the house became silent again, and Margaret began her quiet observations. She noticed how Jason had left a folder on the counter the night before, slightly out of place, with papers partially visible. It was not unusual for him to forget things when he believed no one would examine them. Margaret did not touch the folder immediately. Instead, she continued her day as though nothing had changed, folding laundry, watering the plants, and maintaining the appearance of normalcy that everyone expected from her. But internally she was mapping patterns, noting inconsistencies in conversations and small shifts in behavior. Over the past weeks, Jason had begun discussing financial matters more frequently in her presence, often using simplified explanations as though she would not understand more complex details. He spoke about restructuring accounts and adjusting household responsibilities, always framing it as convenience rather than control. Emily rarely questioned him. Margaret observed the subtle imbalance growing between them, not in loud arguments but in quiet decisions made without her awareness. Later that afternoon, Jason returned earlier than expected. He entered the house with the confidence of someone who believed every space naturally belonged to him. He greeted Margaret briefly, not waiting for a response, and immediately began reviewing documents at the kitchen table. Emily followed shortly after, carrying grocery bags and avoiding direct conversation about anything meaningful. Margaret remained seated in the living room, pretending to read while listening carefully to fragments of their discussion. The words were casual, but the intent behind them was not. Jason spoke about future plans, mentioning adjustments that would simplify their lives, though the changes always seemed to reduce Margaret's involvement rather than increase clarity. She understood now that exclusion did not happen all at once. It happened in layers, in decisions framed as efficiency, in conversations that assumed agreement before consent was ever requested. As evening approached, Margaret walked past the kitchen and briefly saw Jason placing the same folder into his briefcase. He paused for a fraction of a second when he noticed her presence, then continued as if nothing had interrupted him. That small pause confirmed more than any words could. Later that night, Margaret sat alone in her room, listening to the house settle into silence. She did not feel confusion anymore. She felt structure forming in the gaps they had created around her. Every action she had observed was beginning to connect into something clearer, something deliberate. And for the first time, she understood that what they assumed about her was not just incorrect. It was useful. It was during the third morning that Margaret Collins began to notice a change in the rhythm of the household that could not be explained by routine alone. The suburban home in Ohio still looked the same from the outside, with its pale siding and neatly trimmed lawn. But inside, the flow of conversation had shifted into quieter, more calculated patterns. Jason Miller had returned from another early trip into the city, bringing with him the same briefcase that now rarely left his side. He placed it on the kitchen table without hesitation, as if the space already belonged to him more than it belonged to anyone else. Emily Collins moved around him with careful politeness, offering coffee and small talk that filled silence but did not challenge it. Margaret observed from the dining area, her presence acknowledged only when necessary and forgotten immediately afterward. It was not hostility that defined the atmosphere, but omission, as if she existed slightly outside the frame of family life. That morning, Jason spoke more openly than usual, discussing adjustments that would soon simplify their living arrangements. His tone remained calm, almost considerate, yet every sentence carried the subtle assumption that decisions were already made. Emily nodded occasionally, her responses soft and uncertain, as though she had rehearsed agreement rather than reached it naturally. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands resting gently on the edge of her cup, her expression neutral. When Jason mentioned that certain responsibilities might need to be reassigned for efficiency, he glanced briefly in her direction, then continued speaking without waiting for acknowledgement. Later that day, while Emily was outside tending to errands, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen with the sound of the refrigerator humming steadily in the background. Jason had left his briefcase slightly open on the counter again, this time closer to where she stood. Papers were visible, organized but not fully secured. She did not move immediately. Instead, she studied the environment as she always did, measuring behavior rather than reacting to it. When she finally walked past the counter, she did not open the briefcase, but she noted its position and the ease with which it had been left unattended in her presence. It was not carelessness she was witnessing, but assumption. The assumption that she would not look, would not question, would not understand. That afternoon, Jason returned with Emily, and their conversation resumed in fragments between tasks. There was mention of accounts, schedules, and future planning, each phrase carefully neutralized to sound harmless. Emily asked few questions, her attention divided between daily responsibilities and the unspoken expectation of harmony. Margaret remained seated near the window, appearing absorbed in a book she had not turned the page of for several minutes. She was no longer measuring what they said, but how often they excluded her from the meaning behind it. The pattern was becoming clear. She was not being directly opposed, but gradually repositioned into irrelevance. That realization did not create distress in her, but clarity. Later, as evening approached and shadows stretched across the living room, Jason briefly paused near her chair. For a moment, he seemed to consider saying something more, but instead he simply nodded and continued walking. It was a small gesture, easily dismissed by anyone not paying attention, but Margaret understood it differently. It was confirmation that she had already been placed outside the circle of discussion. That night, after the house settled into silence again, Margaret remained awake longer than usual. She did not feel urgency, nor fear, nor confusion. What she felt instead was recognition. The structure of what was happening around her was no longer hidden. It was simply unfolding in front of her, under the assumption that she would never see it for what it truly was. It was not until the fourth morning that the memory of how Jason Miller had spoken began to echo differently inside Margaret Collins' mind. The suburban home in Ohio remained unchanged in structure, but the emotional geography of it had shifted into something more precise, more revealing. Jason had already left early again, leaving behind only the faint trace of cologne and the quiet disruption of his presence in every room he entered. Emily Collins moved through the house with habitual efficiency, but her movements now carried a subtle hesitation whenever she passed Margaret, as if uncertain where she now belonged in relation to her mother. Margaret observed all of it without interruption, continuing her routine as though nothing had altered. Yet her attention had become sharper, more deliberate. That morning, while preparing breakfast, she recalled the exact phrasing Jason had used days earlier, describing her as helpless, as though the word had been chosen carefully rather than casually. At the time, Emily had not responded, and silence had filled the space where disagreement might have existed. Margaret now understood that silence was not absence, but alignment. Later that day, she found herself alone in the living room while Emily took a phone call in another room. Jason's briefcase was again present on the kitchen table, positioned slightly differently than before, as though it had been deliberately placed within her sight but not her reach. The consistency of this pattern was no longer accidental in her mind. It was instructional. She did not approach it, did not touch it, but she studied it in the same way one studies a system that repeats itself. Every detail, every placement, every timing of his departures and returns formed a structure that was becoming impossible to ignore. When Emily returned, her expression carried a mixture of fatigue and restraint, as if she had spent the conversation being told what would soon happen rather than being asked what she thought. She spoke briefly about household matters, then shifted quickly to lighter topics, avoiding anything that might introduce tension. Jason arrived later that afternoon and immediately resumed control of the atmosphere without raising his voice or changing his tone. He spoke about future arrangements again, using language that suggested care while removing choice. Margaret noticed how Emily's responses had begun to shorten, as though agreement had become easier than explanation. Jason did not look at Margaret directly during most of the conversation, but when he did, it was brief and dismissive, as if confirming that she remained where he expected her to be. That evening, after dinner, Margaret remained seated long after the others had left the room. The house settled into its familiar quiet, but it no longer felt passive to her. It felt organized. Every interaction she had witnessed over the past days now aligned into a single direction, one that consistently moved her toward the edges of decision-making. She understood that what was happening was not sudden, nor emotional in its origin. It was incremental, structured, and most importantly, assumed to be invisible to her. As she turned off the light in the living room, she did not feel resistance. She felt confirmation. The way they spoke around her, the way they decided without her, the way they expected her absence from her own relevance had all formed a consistent pattern. And for the first time, Margaret Collins did not interpret it as confusion or coincidence. She interpreted it as intention quietly disguised as normal life. It was on the fifth morning that Margaret Collins began to notice something different, not in what was being said around her, but in what was being left unsaid. The suburban house in Ohio remained calm on the surface, yet every interaction inside it had become increasingly deliberate, as if each conversation was now filtered through an invisible set of rules that excluded her participation. Jason Miller moved through the home with the same confidence as before, but now there was a growing sense of routine authority in the way he placed documents on counters, checked his phone, and spoke to Emily Collins in short, decisive phrases that required no discussion. Emily responded with quiet agreement more often than questions, her energy gradually shifting from engagement to adaptation. Margaret observed this change without comment, continuing to prepare tea and meals as she always had. But her awareness was no longer passive. It was structured. That morning, Jason spoke briefly about adjustments that would soon simplify their household responsibilities. The phrasing was careful, designed to sound considerate rather than directive, but Margaret understood the underlying direction of his words. Emily nodded softly, her hands wrapped around a mug she was no longer drinking from, as if holding it gave her something stable to focus on while decisions formed around her rather than with her. Margaret noticed how Jason avoided long pauses when speaking near her. As though silence might invite questions he preferred not to answer. When he did glance in her direction, it was brief and neutral, lacking acknowledgement rather than hostility. That distinction mattered more to Margaret than he likely realized. Later that afternoon, while Emily stepped outside to take a call, Jason remained in the kitchen reviewing something on his phone. The briefcase that had become a constant presence was now placed near the edge of the table, positioned in a way that suggested habitual trust in his surroundings. Margaret entered the room briefly to retrieve a glass of water, and Jason paused his scrolling for only a second before continuing. There was no tension in the moment, only separation, as though they occupied the same space without sharing the same level of relevance. That evening, Emily returned home quieter than usual, her expression composed but distant. Jason spoke to her immediately, updating her on small logistical matters that sounded ordinary but carried the weight of direction rather than discussion. Emily listened and responded with short affirmations, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Margaret before returning to Jason, as if seeking confirmation of what was expected of her presence. Margaret remained seated in the living room, listening to fragments of their exchange without inserting herself. She began to recognize a consistent structure forming in their communication, one that placed Jason at the center of decisions, Emily at the center of compliance, and herself at the perimeter of acknowledgement. It was not enforced through conflict, but through repetition and assumption. As the evening settled and the house grew quiet again, Margaret walked through each room slowly, noting how naturally she had been repositioned within her own home without a single direct confrontation. There had been no argument, no declaración, no moment of exclusion spoken aloud, only a steady narrowing of participation until silence became her assigned role. When she finally returned to her room that night, she did not feel surprise. She felt confirmation. The pattern she had been tracking was no longer subtle. It was established, and it was accelerating. It was on the sixth morning that Margaret Collins stopped interpreting the household as a series of isolated events and began understanding it as a coordinated system. The suburban home in Ohio still functioned normally on the surface, with morning routines unfolding in familiar patterns, but beneath that surface every interaction now carried a measurable intent. Jason Miller had already established his presence in the kitchen before anyone else fully settled into the day, reviewing something on his phone with the same detached focus he used when making decisions that affected others more than himself. Emily Collins moved through the space with increasing quietness, her responses shorter, her questions fewer, as if she had gradually learned which forms of participation were no longer expected of her. Margaret observed this shift without interruption, continuing her routine of preparing coffee and organizing small household tasks. But her attention was no longer diffused. It was precise. That morning, Jason spoke about a series of adjustments that would take place soon, using language that framed change as simplification. He did not raise his voice, and he did not seek agreement in explicit terms. Instead, he structured his statements in a way that assumed acceptance already existed. Emily nodded at appropriate moments, her expression composed but slightly distant, as though she had learned to align herself with decisions rather than engage with them. Margaret noticed how often Jason interrupted silence with clarification rather than conversation, ensuring there was no space for interpretation outside of his framing. When Emily asked a brief question about timing, Jason responded quickly, redirecting the topic before it could expand into discussion. Margaret remained seated nearby, observing the rhythm of control not as confrontation but as consistency. Later that afternoon, the house became quieter than usual, as Jason left for a meeting in the city and Emily went out for errands. In their absence, Margaret moved slowly through each room, noting the subtle organization that had been gradually imposed over time. Items had been relocated in ways that suggested efficiency rather than familiarity, and shared spaces now reflected usage patterns that excluded her natural presence. When she returned to the kitchen, she found the briefcase again placed on the table, this time slightly more open than before, as if its contents were meant to remain visible within the boundaries of assumption. She did not approach it, but she studied it carefully, recognizing it not as negligence but as confidence in being unchallenged. That evening, when Jason returned, he carried the same composed energy he always brought after meetings. He spoke briefly to Emily about updates and next steps, his tone unchanged, his structure of communication intact. Emily responded with quiet acknowledgement, her posture steady but increasingly reserved. Margaret listened without participating, noticing how her presence in the room no longer influenced the direction of conversation in any meaningful way. She was no longer being excluded through conflict, but through design. After dinner, Jason made a final remark about upcoming arrangements, then ended the conversation without inviting further input. The absence of invitation was more significant than disagreement would have been. It confirmed a boundary that did not need to be spoken aloud. Later, when the house finally settled into silence, Margaret remained seated longer than usual. She understood now that what she had been witnessing was not a gradual misunderstanding within the family, but a deliberate restructuring of roles that assumed her irrelevance as a completed fact rather than a debated possibility. And in that understanding, she did not react outwardly. She simply observed, with the clarity of someone who had finally seen the full shape of what had been forming around her from the very beginning. It was on the 7th morning that Margaret Collins no longer needed to look for patterns, because the patterns were now repeating with predictable precision. The Ohio suburban house was calm in appearance, but the internal structure of relationships had settled into a clear hierarchy that left no room for uncertainty. Jason Miller had already been awake for some time before anyone else entered the kitchen. His presence marked by the familiar placement of his briefcase and the quiet authority in how he occupied space without asking permission from it. Emily Collins moved more cautiously now, her morning routine shaped less by habit and more by anticipation of what would be required of her before decisions were finalized around her. Margaret observed this without reaction, continuing to prepare breakfast with steady movements that revealed nothing of her internal awareness. Jason spoke early that morning, not about change anymore, but about completion. His language had shifted subtly over the past days, from suggestions of simplification to statements that implied finality. He referenced timelines, arrangements, and confirmations as though everything was already in motion and only required acknowledgement. Emily responded with soft agreement, her voice quieter than before, her presence increasingly aligned with acceptance rather than participation. Margaret noticed how Jason no longer paused when speaking in front of her, as if her silence had been fully integrated into his expectations. There was no need to account for her perspective because, in his structure of understanding, it no longer altered outcomes. Later that morning, while Emily was briefly outside attending to errands, Jason remained in the house longer than usual. He reviewed documents at the kitchen table with the same efficiency he always displayed, but now there was a sense of closure in his movements, as though each page he turned brought him closer to a completed plan. Margaret entered the room briefly, not to engage but to observe, and Jason acknowledged her presence with the briefest glance before continuing without interruption. That moment carried no hostility, only confirmation that she had been fully positioned outside the decision-making process. It was no longer necessary to exclude her actively, because she had already been categorized as irrelevant to the structure he believed was in place. When Emily returned, Jason spoke to her in a more definitive tone than before, outlining arrangements that were framed as already settled. Emily listened without questioning, her responses reduced to brief acknowledgments that no longer carried emotional weight. Margaret remained seated nearby, her attention now focused not on individual actions but on the consistency of their direction. Everything Jason said reinforced the same outcome, and everything Emily did reinforced her gradual adaptation to it. There were no disagreements because there was no longer a shared space for interpretation. That evening, after Jason left the room and Emily retreated upstairs, Margaret remained alone in the quiet living room. The house had entered a state of structured stillness, where every movement earlier in the day now felt like preparation rather than conversation. She understood with complete clarity that what had been unfolding was not a misunderstanding or a temporary imbalance, but a finalized system that assumed her absence from relevance as a fixed condition. And in that realization, Margaret did not feel urgency or resistance. She felt precision, as though every observation she had made had now resolved into a single, undeniable conclusion. It was on the 8th morning that the structure Jason Miller had been building inside the Ohio suburban house began to show its first visible weakness, not through conflict, but through an unexpected shift in control that neither he nor Emily Collins had anticipated. Margaret Collins moved through the early hours of the day with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the past week. Yet something in her awareness had changed in a way that no longer required interpretation. The patterns she had observed were now fully understood, and understanding had replaced uncertainty completely. Jason was already in the kitchen when she entered, speaking briefly with Emily about final arrangements in a tone that suggested everything was already resolved and only needed formal acknowledgement. Emily responded as she always had recently, with quiet acceptance that carried no resistance, only adjustment. Margaret listened without interrupting, her presence still treated as observational rather than participatory, yet this time she was no longer measuring them for insight. She was confirming what she already knew. Later that morning, Jason placed several documents on the kitchen table with more deliberate organization than usual, his movements suggesting closure rather than planning. He spoke about confirmations that would be finalized soon, using language that implied completion rather than possibility. Emily nodded, her expression calm but increasingly distant, as though she had learned to exist within decisions already made without her input. Margaret remained seated nearby, her attention steady but no longer searching. The illusion of gradual exclusion had fully resolved into a completed structure in her mind. When Jason left the house for a brief appointment in the city, and Emily stepped outside shortly after to make a phone call, Margaret remained alone in the quiet interior of the home. She walked slowly through each room, not as someone searching for answers, but as someone verifying alignment between perception and reality. Every space reflected the same consistent shift she had been observing. Her presence had been reduced not through confrontation, but through assumption of irrelevance. In the study, she paused longer than usual, her gaze settling on a set of stored documents that had been repeatedly moved in subtle ways over the past days. This time, however, the arrangement no longer felt accidental, felt structured, as though each placement had been designed to create distance rather than confusion. She did not touch anything. Instead, she observed until the meaning became undeniable. Later that afternoon, Jason returned earlier than expected, his demeanor unchanged but his movements slightly more contained, as if something external had begun limiting his confidence. Emily followed shortly after, quieter than before, her responses shorter and more measured. Margaret noticed that Jason no longer spoke with the same uninterrupted certainty he had carried days earlier. There were pauses now, small and involuntary, where before there had been control. That evening, a conversation occurred in fragments rather than structure, with Jason attempting to maintain direction while Emily absorbed information with less certainty than before. Margaret remained present but detached, no longer positioned as irrelevant, but no longer needed for validation either. When Jason finally referenced arrangements that he believed were secure, there was a subtle interruption in the flow of his certainty, as though something unseen had already shifted beneath his assumptions. Margaret did not respond, but she understood completely that what had been presented as inevitability was no longer stable. As the house settled into silence once more that night, Margaret sat alone in the living room, fully aware that the system Jason had constructed around her was no longer operating under the assumptions he had built it upon. What he believed to be finalized had already begun to reverse direction, not through confrontation, but through realization that arrived too late to prevent correction. It was on the 9th morning that everything inside the Ohio suburban house settled into a quiet stillness that no longer felt like routine but like conclusion. Margaret Collins moved through the early light of the home with steady composure, but the internal clarity she carried was now complete. There was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to test. What had once appeared as gradual exclusion had fully revealed itself as a finished structure, and that structure was already beginning to fail under its own assumptions. Jason Miller entered the kitchen later than usual that morning, his movements controlled but no longer effortless. The certainty that had defined his presence in previous days was now tempered by subtle hesitation, as if he was no longer fully aligned with the outcomes he had expected. Emily Collins followed shortly after, her expression quieter than before, her responses reduced to minimal acknowledgement rather than participation. Margaret observed both of them without interruption, her awareness no longer searching for meaning, because meaning had already been confirmed. Jason spoke first, attempting to maintain the same framing of final arrangements that had previously guided every conversation. His tone was measured, but there was a shift in rhythm, a lack of the earlier confidence that had once filled every pause. He referenced confirmations again, but this time the words did not carry the same weight they once had. Emily responded softly, but her voice lacked the same automatic agreement she had shown in previous days. There was hesitation now, small but noticeable, where certainty had once existed. Margaret did not intervene. She simply listened, fully aware that the system Jason had constructed was no longer operating with the stability he believed it had. Later that morning, Jason received a call that required him to leave the house earlier than planned. His departure was quicker than usual, lacking the composed control he had previously maintained in movement and timing. Emily remained behind, standing in the kitchen longer than necessary, as though uncertain where she now belonged within the structure that had been quietly collapsing around her. Margaret remained seated, watching without expression, understanding that the shift she had already recognized was now becoming visible to others as well. When Emily finally spoke, her words were softer, less certain, no longer shaped entirely by alignment with Jason's direction. There was a pause between thoughts that had not been present before. Margaret did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to define itself rather than fill it. It was in that silence that the change became undeniable. The structure Jason had built on assumption and exclusion was no longer stable because the assumptions no longer held the same authority. Later that afternoon, Jason returned briefly, but his presence in the house no longer carried the same dominance it once had. His movements were controlled, but restrained, as though he was adjusting to a shift he had not anticipated. Emily spoke to him with caution rather than automatic agreement, and Margaret noticed that for the first time, Jason did not immediately direct the conversation toward closure or control. Instead, there were pauses, moments where certainty should have been but was not. That evening, the house felt different, not because of noise or conflict, but because of recalibration. Jason's earlier confidence had fractured into something less stable, and Emily's compliance had begun to transform into observation. Margaret remained still through it all, fully aware that what had once been a system designed to render her irrelevant had now reached a point where it could no longer sustain itself without acknowledgement of her presence. And in that realization, she understood that the final shift was not something she needed to create. It was something that had already begun to unfold the moment they stopped seeing her as someone who could see them clearly.